Hi, I'm John Nunn and I'm going to talk about a recent book I've written, Chess Tactics Workbook for Kids, published by Gambit publications. The main content of this book is hundreds of tactical positions for the reader to solve. And they're good not only for kids but also for club players. All the main tactical types are covered: pins, skewers, forks and so on. And there are a series of graded tests at the end so you can check how you've done. I'd like to show you a few positions which give you a good idea of the contents of the book. So let's jump straight in and have a look at the first position. It's white to play, and white is hoping to win. He's a pawn ahead. Indeed, he's got a pawn on the 7th rank, but at the moment it's blocked by his own rook. If the rook moves away, it seems that black can just take the pawn. And you might like to pause the video here to try to work out how white wins. Okay, let's jump to the solution. It's a typical endgame tactic. Most rook moves don't achieve the result white's hoping for, but playing the rook right to the other side of the board does work. White's now threatening to promote the pawn, so black has to take it, and then white gives a check with his rook, creating a skewer. The black king has to move, and white just takes the enemy rook. So a skewer is when two enemy pieces are on the same line, and the first one has to move, and this exposes the piece that's behind to capture by a white piece or by your piece. It's a pretty standard endgame tactic which occurs in many endings, especially rook endings, but it's nevertheless important because a lot of situations eventually resolve to this tactic. Now let's have a look at the second position, which occurs a little bit later in the book, which shows how the tactical ideas featured in the book build on one another. Simple tactical ideas can lead and be used in more complicated tactics. Well, you can see some of the elements from the previous position are also visible here, but for the moment the tactic doesn't work because the black pawn is blocking a possible check along the 7th rank. So now you can pause and look at the position for a few moments to try to figure out how white can win. Okay, now let's go to the solution. Well, first of all, white pushes his pawn, the H pawn. Now white's threatening to just to push it further and then to promote it, so black has to take. So this preliminary pawn sacrifice has removed the blockading black pawn from G7. The 7th rank is now open, and white can use the tactic from the first position to create a skewer which leads to the win of black's rook. It's true this time black has two pawns in return for the rook, but a rook always beats 2 or 3 enemy pawns if none of the enemy pawns are advanced and can pose a threat. So here white can just bring his king up and win the enemy pawns within a few moves. So a preliminary action was required in order to get the tactic from the earlier position to work. Chess tactics are often like that. They build on one another. Simple tactics lead to more complicated ones, and very often different tactical elements combine, what we call a combination, to create a winning sequence of moves. And that's the case in the next position I'm going to show you. Here we have a position again, white to play. White is hoping to win. Material is about equal, so white's going to have to, well, he's going to have to win the black queen one way or another in order to win the position. So now you should pause to try to figure out how white can force the win of black's queen with a sequence of different tactical elements. Alright, let's go to the solution. Here white combines various forks with a pin in order to win the queen. The first move is the surprising bishop sacrifice, which checks the black king and forks the king and the queen, so that black has to take the bishop with either the queen or the pawn. Let's see what happens first of all if he takes with the queen. In that case, white gives a knight check on b5, check to the king, also attacking the queen. Black has to move his king, and white takes the queen and starts gobbling up the enemy pawns as well. So in this case, again, it's a win similar to the previous position. But the most interesting possibility is if black takes the bishop with the pawn. White's win again involves a fork, but this time combined with a pin. First of all, he gives a preliminary check with the rook. Black has only one square to move his king. Must go to b4. And now the knight again comes in with a fork on a different square this time. Check again, attacking king and queen. This time, however, there's an additional element in that white makes use of the pin along the 7th rank. The black rook is pinned, the black pawn is pinned against the queen by the white rook. So black takes the knight, and white again wins the queen. This time black even has 3 pawns for the rook, but as I mentioned, 3 pawns are no match for a rook if they're all very far back and can't pose any threat. So there are 3 forks and a pin altogether in this position, and is an example of how different tactical elements can work together to provide a solution to what was actually quite a tricky position. Now let's go to the final position. This is from the graded exercises at the end of the book. These are all marked in difficulty from 1 star the simplest to 5 stars the most difficult. And this is a 4-star position, so it's one of the more difficult positions in the book. So you might like to think a little bit about this, so you can pause here and figure out how white can force a win. But you also have to bear in mind that black has a tricky defence, which you should take into account. So let's look at the solution. First move is white plays his bishop from c1 to g5, attacking the black queen. In fact, the black queen is trapped in this position. Squares f5 and g6 are covered by the bishop from d3. Bishop on g5 is defended by the knight. All the other squares the queen might go to are either blocked by black pieces or controlled by white. So at first sight, that's the end of the story. But black has this tricky defence. He takes the knight on f3 and counterattacks the white queen. So if white takes the black queen, black takes the white queen. And the upshot of that would be that white wins a piece. Black wins a piece. Well, white can take the bishop with the queen, which actually attacks the rook on a8, but then black can exchange queens, material remains equal, and black's position is satisfactory. So white needs something a bit cleverer than that in order to win. Of course, he can't take the bishop with the pawn. Black takes on g5 with check. But the winning move is the surprising queen to d2. White ignores the emprise black bishop completely, instead removes his queen from attack, and at the same time defends the hitherto undefended bishop on g5. And perhaps surprisingly, this maintains the trap of the black queen. The squares that were covered before by the white bishop remain covered, and the only real difference is that because the knight has gone, the black queen has access to one square it didn't have access to before, namely the square d4. So black takes that, it's the only way to avoid immediate capture of the queen, but now white employs another tactical element, what we call a discovered attack. The bishop stands between the 2 queens. If the bishop can move away with gain of tempo, white would be able to take the enemy queen. Unfortunately, there's a check that does the job just perfectly. Check has to be met immediately, and however black replies, for example, he brings his bishop back, white takes the enemy queen, and he wins the queen for 2 minor pieces. In fact, he even wins it for 1 minor piece because there's an additional threat of mate on d8 here. So The trapping of the enemy piece, the surprising queen move to d2 and the discovered attack all work together to give white a decisive material advantage. Well, this selection of positions should give you an idea of what's in the book. The first position was at the lower end of difficulty for the book, the last position was at the top end, and all levels of difficulty in between are covered. I hope you enjoyed these positions and this video, and I look forward to seeing you for the next video from Gambit Publications.